time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, Kate Brown. Kate Brown is a professor of history at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She is the author of several books, including a biography of No Place, From Ethnic Borderland to Soviet Heartland, Plutopia, Nuclear Families in Atomic Cities and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters, Dispatches from Dystopia, Histories of Places Not Yet Forgotten, and she's currently finishing her book, A Manual for Survival, on the environmental and medical consequences of the Chernobyl disaster, to be published by Norton in 2019. Kate, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So you are in Washington State. You were just over at the Tri-Cities a day or two back regarding a letter that you had written to the Washington Department of Health regarding a study they released in October of this year. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the Washington State Department of Health noticed in about 2012, 2013, a nurse in Prosser, Washington, alerted them that there was a spike in babies born with a rare birth defect called an anencephaly. That's when babies are born without brains. It's a fatal and pretty awful birth defect, and it's part of a category of birth defects called neurotube disorders, which also include spinal bifida. And they started tracking these birth defects and found that between 2010 and 2017, there were 67 neurotube birth defects in this area around in central Washington, and 45 of them, and I think by now it's the numbers, by January of 2018 will be 48, were these babies born with anencephaly. That's a really high rate, in especially the three-county area around the Hanford plant. That's 8.2 babies per 10,000 born. The normal, standard in the United States is about 2 per 10,000 born. So that's, 4 times higher. So that was very alarming, and rightly so. The Department of Health put together a team and did a study, an investigation of this problem. And they published the results of the investigation just this fall. And they said they looked at, what's causing this problem. It's clearly a spike. It's statistically significant. And they looked at, nitrates and said, studies don't show that there's a real link. We don't see these women who are affected being taking in nitrates. Then they looked at radiation, and they quickly dismissed radiation. And they looked at folic acid. Are they taking folic acid? And they determined that both the women in the control and the women who were affected were all not taking folic acid at very high rates. And so they sort of like finished the study at a draw, saying we don't know what are causing these problems. And that's when I myself got upset about it, because I thought, their radiation seems an obvious avenue to explore further in this case. We find, that Hanford produced it's one of the largest sites in the world for producing radioactive isotopes that polluted the environment. The figure comes in around 460 million curies. I mean, it's hard to imagine, just how much that is. There was an accident in 1987 in Brazil. 1,000 curies were spilled, and 4 people died, 200 people were hospitalized, and 2 villages had to be razed. That was 1,000 curies. Now we're talking about 460 million curies. Chernobyl was about 50 million curies, and there's a lot of damage there. So there's a lot of, much of that radiation is still somewhat contained underneath the Hanford site in those big underground tanks that are leaking, and they're trying to fix. But a lot of that is, short-term and long-term radiation that left the area in terms of in gas and in form of water, in forms, going into the aquifer, or just in soil, in dust and soil. So I was surprised that the Department of Health, in just one paragraph, quickly raised the topic of radiation and then dismissed it, saying, radiation levels have been decreasing over time. Radiation isn't leaving the site.
And it isn't like there isn't ample evidence from other facilities of the tie between the neural tube issues and nuclear reactors.
Yes, if we find, and I hooked up with an epidemiologist to write a letter to the state of Washington that neural tube disorders spike in areas around the world that have had significant doses of radioactive isotopes. So there's a place in area in northern England and Wales and in Scotland, really high rates since the 1950s. That's where Great Britain processed plutonium and uranium. There's 2 plants up there. There's a spike in the areas around Chernobyl, and this researcher, Vladimir Verlecki, has been following neurotube disorders since 2000, and he's been tracking them every year. He finds that there are 24 neurotube disorders per 10,000 born, really high area in this mildly, not the hottest spot of the Chernobyl contaminated areas, but at areas where people are still living, they're eating local food, and they're having lots of babies. We also see it in Western Australia, where the British tested nuclear weapons. Big spike there that occurred, in the from 1960 to 1980. The Brits tested nuclear weapons there throughout the 50s. So there's a reason to suspect that there's a correlation between radiation and these neurotube disorders. And there was a Texas study in 2015 that looked at 38,000 mothers who were working in the radiation industries and wore radiation monitors. So they knew these women had been exposed. And they found that they had a risk of having 4 congenital anomalies, including anencephaly. That's just a recent study from 2015. I don't see it cited in the Washington State study. 2016 study found that women working in medical fields who wear dosimeters had a significantly increased prevalence for babies with congenital anomalies. 30% of the mothers in the study who had exposures had babies with congenital birth defects, 6% of the control. So we see there a 5 times difference. So there's lots of evidence that makes me suspect that we could look a little bit more in a more concentrated fashion at this spike in central Washington. And one thing that I was wondering about is why not just they went and they talked to these women, they asked them questions about their lifestyle and what they eat and where they drink their water. But why not look at their bodies? There's something called a whole body counter. You put a person in it, they sit there for 15 minutes. There's, it's just like sitting in a dental chair, nothing happens. And then you can count how many gamma rays are coming off of a body. That would be a good place to start.
Yeah, it would seem like an obvious thing to do if you were at least, investigating this with any depth. Did they have anybody they made this special committee. Did they have anyone who was an expert in nuclear issues on the committee?
Not that I can see, no. So that, an epidemiologist at Duke University suggested that they take the tissue from the fetuses and, look for chromosomal aberrations in the blood cells, that look for DNA aberrations, in the tissue of these babies. And that too, there's a way, epidemiology is a very, very tricky and difficult field because there are so many balls in motion. There's the climate, there's the vagaries of different radioactive isotopes that act differently, both in different environments and in people's bodies. There's historic monitoring, historic releases of radiation, of which we don't have a very good fix in Washington State. They monitored over the decades on site, inside the cyclone fencing that was walled off, but there wasn't a lot of monitoring off site where the winds went. The winds from Hanford went all the way to Wenatchee and Walla Walla and Spokane. When I was out there last week, there was an inversion effect. So there was a fog, big heavy fog in eastern Washington. There's a ban burn. Asthmatics weren't supposed to go outside because the ceiling of air covers the Columbia Basin and sort of traps air inside, and then it just circulates slowly, and stays. So any kind of smoke or smog or anything coming out of those stacks over the years would just stay and fall into that area. And so there's heavy concentrations in certain places, but I don't see a lot of monitoring of food and wine and products that are coming from that. Our new California north is central Washington. In Ukraine, they monitor food. You can't, if you have food that's higher than 450 becquerels a kilogram, you can't sell it on the markets. In Belarus, it's as low as 150 becquerels a kilogram. But in the United States, we have a pretty high limit for radiation in our food. It's 1,250 becquerels a kilogram. But I'm not sure that, I don't know to what extent food is getting monitored that's produced on those soils out there.
Perhaps a program we can look into. So was there any testing done at Hanford? I know it was spotty. I mean, you just said it was just during the times when production wasn't at its peak, which doesn't really make sense in a certain aspect, unless you didn't want that information getting
testing
out.
For these same neurotube disorders.
Yeah, and just Yeah,
well, they found there was a study done, and this is also not cited in the Washington State report. There was a study done that was published in 1986 by Lowell Seaver. He was a Hanford Labs or Pacific Northwest Labs researcher, and he found a spike of these same congenital anomalies, neurotube disorders, among Hanford workers when he did a retrospective study from 1957 to 1980. And he found that there was a link between the exposures those individual workers received and the rate of neurotube disorders among the offspring. And he looked, he said, well, this is really strange, but I think this is a false positive result, because he compared it to the rates of birth defects in Japan. And the gold standard for radiation medicine is the long-running American and Japanese-sponsored Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. They went in 1950, and they looked at survivors of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima of the atomic bombs. And then they followed these people, and they still are following these people, tracking them for disease. And so this study didn't find these neurotube disorders, and so Seaver concluded this isn't really a thing, because the gold standard is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there's a major difference between Hiroshima and Hanford, and that is that Hiroshima's exposures was one big blast. It was like getting one big X-ray, and it lasted for less than a second, and then the radiation, for the most part, dissipated. Now, Hanford is like a slow drip. People out there got chronic, low doses of exposures for 4 decades of production, and then long-lasting isotopes continue to expose people. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So these two nuclear incidences aren't really very relatable, but that's what we've been doing in terms of radiation medicine for the last 5 decades. Is if it doesn't track with the Hiroshima studies, it's not a verifiable, radiation medicine alert or a categorizable disease. And so Seaver in the 1986 dismissed his findings. They did a new study, found the same results. Those were also dismissed as false positive. But I'm thinking we should maybe think that this isn't just an epidemic that began in 2010, that if we look back retrospectively, we might see a longer pattern or series of spikes. We might actually find out more. And what's pretty fascinating about Hanford is that they ran a program in the Tri-City areas in the late 1950s and 60s, where they took whole body counters, they put them in buses, they drove them out to schools, and they tested kids. They ran kids through these whole body counters, and then they gave them a comic book and a lollipop and sent them back to class. Well, this data, I haven't found this medical data, but hopefully it's still there somewhere. And if researchers could go back and look at that, they would have a pretty good set of records that gave researchers data, doses, and bodies, and then we could go and follow them up just like they did in Hiroshima and see what happened to them, their reproductive lives to follow, their health patterns to follow. What surprises me about the whole Hanford case as I've researched this for the last decade is that there has been a surprising lack of curiosity among scientists to ask open-ended questions. Not like, this is what we find in Hiroshima, we don't find it here, so let's not look. Doses are too small, let's not look, but rather ask the questions of what happens to people when they're exposed over long periods of time to low doses of radiation. Is there an effect? Just ask that question without any kind of assumptions behind it.
And didn't the Soviets do that?
Yeah, the Soviets, and I wrote a book called Plutopia about the first two cities in the world to produce plutonium, and that was Richland was the city and Hanford was the plant. And in Russia, it was a plant called Mayak, and the city was called Ozyorsk, which means Lakedale in Russian. And the same kind of city like Richland, it was a closed city just for nuclear workers. And the Russians ran out of underground storage tanks for the highest level radioactive waste in 1949. And they were in a big race with the United States to build nuclear weapons because they felt like they needed a nuclear shield. So they had two choices: shut down production till they could build more underground waste tanks, or just dump the high-level radioactive waste into the local river and hope that nothing bad happens. And because they were in a hurry, and because they didn't care much about the local population, they did exactly that. They dumped 3.2 million curies into the Tietcha River. And then 3 years later, they went downriver where people lived on the river, drank from the river, fished in it, swam in it, bathed in it, et cetera. And they found highly contaminated communities. Everything was ticking, you know, cooking pots and kids' stomachs. So they evacuated the area, except for a couple of villages they left in place. They were either too large to move or they did get curious. And so they started a medical file on everybody who lived in a village of Muslumovo. And for 4 generations, they've been tracking these people who still live in this town on that radioactive river. And they, yes, have found a similar spike in birth defects and a whole, you know, cancers, problems with people's autoimmune systems, circulation disorders, digestive tract disorders, and thyroid and endocrine problems are massive in that area. In the town of Muslumovo, 97% of the kids who live in the town have one chronic disease or another. So that means 3% are healthy.
So the Soviets actively and willfully did testing on their people with the understanding that they thought that the results would never get out, and they just, you know, they wanted the info. Then here in the U.S. at Hanford, it was a subject that came up, but they didn't want to pursue it because of PR issues. Isn't that right? Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, unfortunately, one of the problems of an open society is that you're always going to have some kind of leak to the media. Somebody at some point starts to talk, and then it's a huge liability issue. So what I find in contrast to Russia is that in the United States, scientists, you know, there's a big lab out at Hanford all these years, but scientists really didn't ask these questions. They went out and they would go to even as far as Walla Walla, and they would pick up milk samples and they'd test them, and they'd find radioactive iodine in the milk, and they'd come back and say, well, it's not so bad. And then they would stop testing the milk, right? I find one study, there's a community right across the river from Hanford. And they did a study there. It's called Ringgold. And they found 20 people to participate in the study, and they did whole body counts, and they looked at the whole medical complement of this community. It included adults and children. And they found 2 kids with really high counts of radioactive iodine in their thyroids and high counts of cesium in their bodies. And they said, actually, that's not bad, 2 out of 20. But that's the biggest, you know, sort of local study of population that I've been able to find is 20 people out of, you know, several 100,000 who lived in that area, farmed downwind, drew water from that. You know, at one point, peak of production, 18,000 curies a day was being dumped into the Columbia River, from which farmers were irrigating.
But there is evidence available if you go to things like the cemeteries over in eastern Washington, Walla Walla, and other ones where there's incredible spikes in the number of babies that died during certain periods of time.
Yeah, there's and you know, and these are in the realm of what scientists would call anecdotal, and granted, yes, this is anecdotal evidence, but in light of the fact that we don't have, you know, serious study, these are good clues to look at to draw our attention to places. So. Reporters found in the 1990s, when this story broke, that in Spokane County there was a a cemetery that had about 680 graves, and over a third of them were babies that died in the 1950s. That's a really high rate of babies dying. So what we find is that when we have high rates of infant mortality, it tells us something. And historically, until about 1950, babies who died, infants who died, and add to this infant mortality rate, were mostly kids who died from disease, complications at birth, malnutrition. But after 1950, and that number dropped over time as Northern Europe and the United States got more affluent, fewer and fewer babies are dying. Until 1950, when that rate starts to decline at less steeply. And researchers went back, for instance, in Northern England, where they have public, socialized medicine, so they have public records, and they track almost everybody when you have a socialized medicine system. And in England, they noticed that now all of a sudden babies were dying from different causes after 1950. They were dying from, the most prevalent rate was from congenital malformations. And that trend continued from 1950 to 1980, all throughout Northern Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the United States as well, and Australia. And so they started to wonder, well, what could that be? And then after 1980, those rates declined of congenital malformation. So why would that be? Nitrates, pesticides, right after 1950, we have green farming, industrial agriculture. That adds a lot of toxins into the food chain and into the air. But the other big thing, but that doesn't drop off in 1980. In fact, after 1980, we've only had yet more chemicals in our food. But what happens between 1950 and 1980 is the period in which there was lots, over 2,000 bomb tests from nuclear weapons that were blown up around the world. Every nuclear event is global, and that radioactive gases take to the air and they circulate the globe. And lots of it actually tends to go north. One reason that Scotland, we think, and Wales got hit so hard is that it's a windy place and it's a wet place. So when the rain falls, it brings down precipitation, and with the precipitation comes radioactive particles and gases. So we do see this rise in congenital malformations during the time, atmospheric testing stopped in the early 1960s, and there was sort of that's by the mid-60s, those numbers start to fall until about 1980. So there's reasons why we should be looking more closely at these trends, and there's amazing reasons why historians should get involved.
You note in your letter, you say in 1952, Richland doctors noted that in Richland schools, 25% of children had some kind of birth defect.
Right.
That's a phenomenally high number.
Phenomenally high number. And, I don't have any more. That's just a report that, I read, sent in, no more details. What did that mean? What I find, and this is what Lowell Sievell will find when he did his study, is that he couldn't look at Richland workers' medical records until 1957. That's because the Cadlick Hospital out there was a government run by the Atomic Energy Commission until, while that was not a not incorporated state, it was a city. It was a very strange city, and that was run by the corporation, the contractor, which is DuPont and then General Electric. It was owned by the federal government and managed by the Atomic Energy Commission. So those medical records from the local hospital, which was also administered with federal funds, seemed to Lowell Sievell, who worked out there, didn't have access to those records in the 1950s. So we don't know much about that 25% of the kids in the public schools had birth defects. I mean, they were healthy enough to get to school, but they still had birth defects. That's a high rate. What's that about? I think we should be asking more questions.
You were also mentioning previously about collecting milk samples and testing those. Again, I know from doing interviews with downwinders that one of the programs they also had, at least for people who worked at the Hanford facility, was regular urine testing, where it wouldn't be uncommon to put your urine out, in a milk-type bottle out on the porch that would get picked up, let's say once a week or whatever, and tested. So there must be some significant data there alone.
Right. Yes. And so we're in terms of epidemiology, we're sitting on a gold mine. And this was a very political conflict in the 1990s here in Washington State between as they were doing the the dose reconstruction program, the HEDR program that was took years, millions of dollars, and was issued saying, we don't find any thyroid problems, no spike in thyroid problems. And people out there got so upset, the downwinders got so upset that the Center for Disease Control came in and did a review of that study. The review is actually, it's marvelous to look at the two. There's a small original document, and then the review of it is about 4 times thicker, listing all the problems with this original dose reconstruction project. So it ended in a draw, right? The first study said we don't see any spike in thyroid problems. The second one said that the first study was flawed in many, many, many ways. But then no third follow-up study followed, and the downwinders, largely they went to court. They fought for the defense contractors for 25 years. Defense contractors were indemnified by the U.S. government, so the U.S. government, the taxpayers, paid for these legal fees, which amounted to be $60 million. Meanwhile, the plaintiffs' lawyers went broke. They got to retirement age and beyond, and the plaintiffs were sick, and many of them died. And they ended up having less than a $6,000 payoff, settling out of court at the end of that 25 years. So we haven't really seen much in the way of I would say a real accounting of what the medical impact of Hanford has been to that local community. That was the only, because of the Hiroshima studies, only thyroid cancers and thyroid disease were allowable as an approved radiation result, from human exposures. And so all kinds of other possible problems that people were talking about out there were discounted right off as something that would never hold up in court. So without a court case, unfortunately, in the United States, we don't tend to have examinations of these, potentially very explosive and politically very sensitive medical problems related to our exposures. So, for instance, we just had that big hurricane in Houston. Big, oil processing plants, chemical plants, flooded, exploded, fires, explosions, flooding. Now all that, got all around, flowed through people's houses, through soils. People out there won't be a study of what those new exposures were after the hurricane, unless people, make a big fuss and demand it, and we don't have some kind of automatic accounting in this country for rights, biological rights, to say we should have the right to live in a healthy environment. And if not, we should be able to figure out why and clean it up, end our exposures.
And it's not help that the media, the corporate media, doesn't cover these issues with any regularity or serious focus. I was just talking to someone this morning who had never heard of Hanford. So
it was somebody here in Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's astounding.
Yeah. But not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually out of time. So with that, I want to thank you for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.